Excuse me.
Man expecting the worst to leap out of the snow at the next step, eyes shifting in an unceasing watch, disquieting cloaks streaming in the wind to leave hands free. When an Aes Sedai worried, her warrior worried, and the sitters were too absorbed to think of calming the men. Egwene was just as glad to see it. If the sitters were troubled, they had not yet made up their minds. When Bryn rode out to confer with Uno, she took the opportunity to ask what the two women had learned about Aes Sedai and tower guards in Andor. Not much, Swan replied in a tight voice. Shaggy Bella did not seem to be having any difficulty with the pace, but Swan did, gripping her reins tightly in one hand and the pommel of her saddle with the other. As near as I can make out, there are 50 rumors and no facts. It's a likely sort of tale to spring up, but it might still be true. Bella lurched, her front hooves sinking deep, and Swan gasped. The light burn all horses! Shiriam had learned no more. She shook her head and sighed irritably. It sounds all feathers and nonsense to me, Mother. There are always rumors of sisters sneaking about. Didn't you ever learn to ride, Swan? She added, her voice suddenly dripping derision. By tonight you'll be too sore to walk. Shiriam's nerves must have been ragged for her to burst out so openly. From the way she kept shifting in her saddle, she had already achieved her prediction for Swan. Swan's eyes hardened, and she opened her mouth, already half snarling, never mind who was watching from behind the banner. Be still, both of you, Egwene snapped. She took a deep, calming breath. She was a bit ragged herself. Whatever Arathel believed, any force Elida sent to interfere with them would be too large for sneaking. That left the Black Tower. A disaster in the making. You got further plucking the chicken in front of you than trying to start on one up a tree, especially when the tree was in another country and there might not even be another chicken. Still, she bit off her words in giving Shiriam instructions for once they reached the camp. She was the Amerlin seat, and that meant all Aes Sedai were her responsibility, even those following Elida. Her voice was rock steady, though. It was too late to be frightened once you grabbed the wolf by the ears. Shiriam's tilted eyes went wide at the orders. Mother, if I may ask, why... She trailed off under Egwene's level gaze and swallowed. It will be as you say, Mother, she said slowly. Strange. I remember the day you and Nynaeve came to the tower. Two girls who couldn't decide whether to be excited or frightened. So much has changed since then. Everything. Nothing stays the same forever, Egwene told her. She gave Swan a significant look, but Swan refused to see. She appeared to be sulking. Shiriam looked sick. Lord Bryn returned then, and he must have sensed the mood among them. Aside from saying that they were making good time, he kept his mouth shut. A wise man. Making good time or not, the sun was sitting almost on the treetops when they finally rode through the army's sprawling camp. Wagons and tents cast long shadows
Hey,
across the
Shaz, how
snow,
you doing?
and a number of men were hard at
Hope
work
you're doing
building yet
well.
more low shelters out of brush. There were not nearly enough tents, even for all the soldiers, and the camp held almost as many harness makers and laundresses and fletchers and the like, all those who inevitably followed any army. The ringing of anvils spoke of farriers and armorers and blacksmiths still at their labors. Cook fires were burning everywhere, and the cavalry peeled away, eager for warmth and
I'm not
hot
too
food
bad. Can't
as soon as
complain
their
though.
wearily plodding animals were cared for. Surprisingly, Bryn rode on at Egwene's side after she dismissed him. If you will allow, Mother, he said, I thought I might accompany you a while longer. Shiriam actually twisted in her saddle to stare in astonishment. Swan stared too, straight ahead, as if not daring to turn her suddenly wide eyes toward him. What did he think he could do? Act as her bodyguard? Against sisters? That fellow with the drippy nose would do as well. Reveal just how completely he was on her side? Tomorrow was time enough for that if all went well tonight. That revelation now might easily stampede the hall in directions she hardly dared contemplate. Tonight is for Aes Sedai business, she told him firmly. But silly as the suggestion was, he had offered to put himself at risk for her. There was no telling his reasons. Who knew why a man did anything? Yet she owed him for that, among other things. Unless I send Swan to you tonight, Lord Bryn, you should leave before morning. If blame for today attaches itself to me, it might reflect on you, too. Staying could prove dangerous, even fatal. I don't think they would need much excuse. No need to name who they were. I gave my word, he replied quietly, patting Traveller's neck. To Tarvalin. Pausing, he glanced toward Swan. It was less a hesitation than a consideration. Whatever tonight's business is, he said finally, remember that you have 30,000 men and Gareth Bryn behind you. That should count for something even among Aes Sedai. Until tomorrow, Mother. Reining his big-nosed bay around, he called over his shoulder, I expect to see you tomorrow too, Swan. Nothing changes that. Swan stared at his back as he rode away. There was anguish in her eyes. Egwene could not help staring too. He had never been so open before, not nearly. Why now, of all times? Crossing the 40 or 50 paces that separated the armored camp from the Aes Sedais, she nodded to Shiriam, who drew rein at the first touch. He and Swan rode on. Behind them, Shiriam's voice rose, surprisingly clear and steady. The Amerlin seat calls the hall to sit this day in formal session. Let preparations be made with all speed. Egwene scratched back. From her tent, a bony groom, kicking her layered woolen skirts, came running to take Daishar and Bella. Her face was pinched, and she barely ducked her head before hurrying away with the horses as quickly as she had come. The warmth of the glowing braziers inside was like a fist closing down. Egwene had not realized how cold it was outside until then, or how cold she was. Chesa took her cloak and exclaimed when she felt her hands, Why, you're iced to the bone, Mother. Chattering away, she bustled around, folding Egwene's cloak and Swan's, smoothing the neatly turned-down blankets on Egwene's cot, touching a tray set on one of the chests that had been pulled down from the stack. I'd jump right into bed with hot bricks all around if I was that chilled, as soon as I'd eaten anyway. Warm outside does only so much good without warm inside. I'll fetch a few extra bricks to tuck under your feet while you sup. And for Swan, said I, of course. Oh, if I was as hungry as you must be, I know I'd be tempted to gulp my food, but that always gives me pains in the stomach. Pausing by the tray, she eyed Egwene, and nodded with satisfaction when she said that she would not eat too fast. Making a sober answer was not easy. Chesa was always refreshing, but after today, Egwene almost laughed with pleasure. There were no complications with Chesa. 2 bright bowls of lentil stew stood on the tray, along with a tall pitcher of spiced wine, 2 silver cups, and 2 large rolls. Somehow the woman had known Swan would be eating with her. Steam rose from the bowls and pitcher. How often Chesa had to change that tray to make sure warm food greeted Egwene straight away? Simple and uncomplicated, and as caring as a mother or a friend. I must forego bed for now, Chesa. I've work yet tonight. Would you leave us? Swan shook her head as the tent flap fell behind the plump woman. Are you sure she hasn't been in your service since you were a babe? She muttered. Taking one of the bowls, a roll, and a spoon, Egwene settled into her chair with a sigh. She also embraced the source and warded the tent against listeners. Unfortunately, Saidar made her all that much more aware of half-frozen hands and feet. The bits in between were not much warmer. The bowl seemed almost too warm to handle, and the roll as well. Oh, how she would have loved to have those hot bricks. Is there anything more we can do? She asked, and promptly gulped down a spoonful of stew. She was ravenous, and no wonder, with nothing since breakfast, and that early. Lentils and woody carrots tasted like her mother's finest cooking. I can't think of anything, but can you? Whatever can be done has been. There isn't anything else, short of the Creator putting a hand in. Swan took the other bowl and dropped onto the low stool, but then she sat staring into her stew and stirring it with her spoon. You wouldn't really tell him, would you? She said finally. I couldn't bear if he knew. Why on earth not? He'd take advantage, Swan said darkly. Oh, not that. I don't think that. She was quite prudish in some areas. But the man would make my life the pit of doom. And washing his small clothes and polishing his boots and his saddle every day was not? Egwene sighed. How could such a sensible, intelligent, capable woman turn into a scatterbrain over this one subject? Like a hissing viper, an image rose in her head. Herself, sitting on Gawain's knee, playing kissing games. In a tavern. She shoved it away hard. Swan, I need your experience. I need your brain. I can't afford to have you half-witted because of Lord Bryn. If you can't pull yourself together, I'll pay him what you owe and forbid you to see him. I will. I said I'd work off the debt, Swan said stubbornly. I have as much honor as Lord Gareth Bloody Bryn, as much and more. He keeps his word and I keep mine. Besides, Min told me I have to stay close to him or we'll both die, or something like that. A pinkness in her cheeks gave her away, though. Her honor and Min's viewing notwithstanding, she was simply willing to put up with anything to be near the man. Very well. You're besotted, and if I tell you to stay away from him, you'll either disobey or mope and wrap the rest of your brains in a cloud. What are you going to do about him? Scowling indignantly, Swan went on for some little time, growling what she would like to do about Gareth Bloody Bryn. He would have enjoyed none of it. Some he might not have survived. Swan, Egwene said warningly, you deny one more time what's plain as your nose, and I'll tell him and give him the money. Swan pouted sullenly. She pouted. Sullenly. Swan! I don't have time to be in love. I barely have time to think between working for you and him, and even if everything goes right tonight, I'll have twice as much to do. Besides, her face fell and she shifted on the stool. What if he doesn't return my feelings? She muttered. He's never even tried to kiss me. All he cares about is whether his shirts are clean. Egwene scraped her spoon through her bowl and was surprised when it came up empty. Nothing remained of the roll but a few crumbs on her dress. Light, her middle still felt hollow. She eyed Swan's bowl hopefully. The woman seemed to have little interest in anything but drawing circles in the lentils. A sudden thought occurred to her. Why had Lord Bryn insisted that Swan work off her debt, even after learning who she was? Just because she had said she would? It was a preposterous arrangement, except that it did keep her close to him when nothing else would have. For that matter, she herself had often wondered why Bryn had agreed to build the army. He had to have known there was a very good chance he was laying his head on the chopping block. And why he had offered that army to her, a girl Amerlin with no real authority and not a friend among the sisters except Swan, as far as he knew. Could the answer to all of these questions be as simple as he loved Swan? No. Most men were frivolous and flighty, but that was truly preposterous. Still, she offered the suggestion, if only to amuse Swan. It might cheer her a little. Swan snorted in disbelief. It sounded odd coming from that pretty face, but no one could put quite so much expression into a snort as she did. He's not a total idiot, she said dryly. In fact, he has a good head on his shoulders. He thinks like a woman most of the time. I still haven't heard you say you'll straighten up, Swan, Egwene persisted. You have to, one way or another. Well, of course I will. I don't know what's been the matter with me. It isn't as if I never kissed a man before. Her eyes narrowed suddenly, as if she expected Egwene to challenge her on that. I haven't spent my whole life in the tower. This is ridiculous. Chattering about men tonight of all nights. Peering into her bowl, she seemed to realize for the first time that it held food. She filled her spoon, gesturing with it at Egwene. You have to be careful of your timing, more now than ever. If Romonda or Lelaine grabs the tiller, you'll never get your hands on it. Ridiculous or not, something certainly had restored Swan's appetite. She went through her stew faster than Egwene had hers, and not a crumb of the roll escaped her. Egwene found that she had drawn her fingers through her own empty bowl. There was nothing for it then but to lick off the last few lentils, of course. Discussing what was to happen tonight served no real point. They had honed and refined what Egwene was to say and when so many times that she was surprised she had not dreamed of it. She certainly could have done her part in her sleep. Swan insisted anyway, skirting very near the point where Egwene would have to call her down, going over it again and again, bringing up possibilities they had discussed before 100 times. Strangely, Swan had found herself a very good mood. She even essayed a little humor, unusual for her of late, though some was on the gallows side. "You know, Romanda wanted to be Amerlin herself once," she said at one point. "I've heard it was Tamra getting the Swan staff that made her stalk off into retirement like a gull with her tail feathers clipped. I'll lay a silver mark I don't have to a fish scale that her eyes bulged twice as much as Lillian's. And later, I wish I could be there to hear them howl. Somebody's going to before much longer, and I'd rather it was them than us. I never had the voice for singing." She actually sang a little snatch about staring across the river at a boy and having no boat. She was right. Her voice was pleasant in its fashion, but she could not carry a tune in a bucket. And later still, "A good thing I have such a sweet face now. If this goes badly, they'll dress the pair of us for dolls and sit us on a shelf to admire. Of course we might have accidents instead. Dolls do get broken. Gareth Bryn will have to find someone else to bully." She really laughed at that. Egwene felt considerable relief when the tent flap bulged inward briefly, announcing someone who knew enough not to enter where there was a ward. She really did not want to hear where Swan's humor went from there. As soon as she released the ward, Shiriam stepped inside, accompanied by a rush of air that seemed 10 times as cold as earlier. "It's time, Mother. Everything is ready." Her tilted eyes were wide, and she licked her lips with the tip of her tongue. Swan bounded to her feet and seized her cloak from Egwene's cot, but she paused in the act of draping it on her shoulders. "I have sailed the Fingers of the Dragon in the dark, you know," she said seriously, "and netted a lionfish once with my father. It can be done." Shiriam frowned as Swan darted out, letting in more cold. "Sometimes I think," she began, but whatever she sometimes thought she did not share. "Why are you doing this, Mother?" she asked instead. "All of it, today at the lake, calling the hall tonight. Why did you have us spend all day yesterday talking about Loghain to everybody we met? I'd think you might share it with me. I am your keeper. I did swear fealty." "I tell you what you need to know," Egwene said, swinging her cloak around her shoulders. There was no need to say that she trusted a forced oath only so far, even a sister's, and Shiriam might find a reason to let a word slip into the wrong ear, despite that oath. After all, Aes Sedai were noted for finding loopholes in what they had said. She did not really believe that would happen, but just as with Lord Bryn, she could not take even small chances unless she had to. "I have to tell you," Shiriam said bitterly. "I think tomorrow Romanda or Lillian will be your keeper of the chronicles, and I'll be serving a penance for not warning the hall. And I think you might envy me." Egwene nodded. "All too possible. Shall we go?" The sun made a red dome on the treetops to the west, and a lurid light shone off the snow. Servants marked Egwene's passage along the deep paths with silent bows and curtsies. Their faces were troubled or else blank. Servants could pick up the moods of those they served almost as quickly as warders. Not a sister was to be seen at first, and then they all were, in a great gathering 3 deep around a pavilion set up in the only open space in the camp large enough, the area used by sisters skimming to the dovecotes in Saladar and traveling back with reports from the eyes and ears. A large, much-mended piece of heavy canvas, not a patch on the splendor of the canopy at the lake. It had been a great deal of effort to set up. Most often in the past 2 months the hall had convened much as they had yesterday morning, or perhaps squeezed into one of the larger tents. The pavilion had been erected only twice since leaving Saladar, both times for a trial. Noticing Egwene and Shiriam's approach, Sisters in the back murmured to those ahead, and a gap opened to let them through. Expressionless eyes watched the pair of them, giving not a clue to whether the watching sisters knew or even suspected what was happening. Not a clue to what they thought. Butterflies stirred in Egwene's stomach. A rosebud. Calm. She stepped onto the layered carpets, woven in bright flowers and a dozen different patterns, and moved through the ring of braziers set up around the canopy's rim, and Shiriam began. "She comes! She comes!" If she sounded a little less grand than usual, a touch nervous, it was small wonder. The polished benches and cloth-covered boxes from the lake were in use again. They made a much more formal sight than the mismatched gaggle of chairs that had been used previously. 2 slanting lines of 9 grouped by 3s, green, gray, and yellow to one side, white, brown, and blue to the other. At the wide end, farthest from Egwene, stood the striped box and bench for the Amerlin seat. Sitting there, she would be the focus of every eye, very much aware that she was 1, facing 18. As well, she had not changed her clothes. Every sitter still wore her finery from the lake, only adding her shawl. A rosebud. Calm. One of the benches was empty, though only for a moment longer. Delana came rushing in just as Shiriam finished her litany. Looking breathless and flustered, the gray sitter scrambled up to her seat, between Varalin and Quamesa, with little of her usual grace. She wore a sickly grin, and toyed nervously with the fire drops around her neck. Anyone might have thought she was the one on trial. Calm, no one was on trial. Yet. Egwene started slowly across the carpets between 2 rows, with Shiriam close behind, and Quamesa stood. The light of Saidar suddenly shone around the dark, slender woman, youngest of the sitters. Tonight there would be no skimping of the formalities. "What is brought before the hall of the tower is for the hall alone to consider," Quamesa announced. "Whosoever intrudes unbidden, woman or man, initiate or outsider, whether they come in peace or in anger, I will bind according to the law, to face the law. Know that what I speak is true, it will and shall be done." That formula was older than the oath against speaking untruth, from a time when almost as many Amerlins died by assassination as by all other causes put together. Egwene continued her measured tread. It was an effort not to touch her stole for a reminder. She tried to concentrate on the bench ahead. Quamesa resumed her seat, still shining with the power, and among the whites, Ealdrin rose, the glow surrounding her as well. With her dark golden hair and big, pale brown eyes, she was quite lovely when she smiled, but tonight a stone had more expression than she. "There are those within earshot who are not of the hall," she said in a cool voice strong with the accents of Tarabon. "What is spoken in the hall of the tower is for the hall alone to hear, until and unless the hall decides otherwise. I will make us private. I will seal our words to our ears only." Weaving a ward that walled the entire pavilion, she sat. There was a stir among the sisters outside, who now must watch the hall move in utter silence. Strange that so much among sitters depended on age, when distinction by age was next to anathema among the rest of Aes Sedai. Could Swan have seen a pattern in the sitters' ages? No. Focus. Calm and focus. Gripping the edges of her cloak, Egwene stepped up onto the brightly striped box and turned. Lilane was already on her feet, blue-fringed shawl looped across her arms, and Ramonda was rising without even waiting for Egwene to sit. She dared not let either seize the tiller. "I call a question before the hall," she said in a loud, firm voice. "Who will stand to declare war against the usurper Elida do Avrinia Royhan?" And then she sat, throwing off her cloak and letting it fall across the bench. Standing beside her on the carpets, Shiriam appeared quite cool and collected, but she made a small sound, almost a whimper. Egwene did not think anyone else had heard. She hoped not. There was a brief moment of shock, women frozen on their seats, staring at her in amazement. Perhaps as much because she had asked at all as what she had asked. No one put a question before the hall before sounding out the sitters. It just was not done, for practical reasons as much as tradition. At last Lilane spoke. "We do not declare war on individuals," she said in a dry voice. "Not even on traitors like Elida. In any case, I call to shelve your question while we deal with more immediate matters." She had had time to gather herself since the ride back. Her face was merely hard now, not thunderous. Brushing blue-slashed skirts as if brushing away Elida, or perhaps Egwene, she turned her attention to the other sitters. "What brings us to sit tonight is, I was about to say simple, but it isn't. Open the novice book. We would have grandmothers clamoring to be tested. Remain here a month? I hardly need list the difficulties, beginning with spending half our gold without coming a foot nearer Tarvalon. And as for not crossing into Andor, my sister Lilane, in her anxiety, has forgotten who has the right to speak first," Romanda cut in smoothly. Her smile managed to make Lilane appear merry. Still, she took her time adjusting her shawl just as she wanted, a woman with all the time in the world. "I have 2 questions to call before the hall, and in the second I will address Lilane's concerns. Unfortunately for her, my first question concerns Lilane's own fitness to continue in the hall." Her smile widened without growing the slightest bit warmer. Lilane sat slowly, her scowl quite open. "A question of war cannot be shelved," Egwene said in a carrying tone. "It must be answered before any question called after it. That is the law." Quick, questioning glances passed between sitters. "Is that so?" Janya said finally. Squinting thoughtfully, she twisted on her bench to address the woman next to her. "Takima, you remember everything you read, and I'm sure I remember you saying you had read the law of war. Is that what it says?" Egwene held her breath. The White Tower had sent soldiers to any number of wars over the last 1,000 years, but always in response to a plea for help from at least 2 thrones, and it always had been their war, not the Tower's. The last time the Tower itself actually declared war had been against Arthur Hawkwing. Swan said that now only a few librarians knew much more than that there was a law of war. Short, with long dark hair to her waist and skin the color of aged ivory, Takima often reminded people of a bird, tilting her head in thought. Now she looked like a bird that wanted to take flight, shifting on her seat, adjusting her shawl, unnecessarily straightening her cap of pearls and sapphires. "It is," she said finally, and clamped her mouth shut. Egwene quietly started breathing again. "It seems," Romanda said in a clipped tone, "that Swan Santre has been teaching you well. Mother, how speak you in support of declaring war on a woman?" She sounded as if she were trying to push something disagreeable out of her way, and she dropped onto her seat, waiting for it to depart. Egwene nodded graciously anyway and rose. She met the sitters' gazes one by one, levelly, firmly. Takima avoided her eyes. Light, the woman knew. But she had not said anything. Would she hold silent long enough? It was too late to change plans. "Today we find ourselves confronted by an army, led by people who doubt us. That army would not be there otherwise." Egwene wanted to put passion into her voice, to let it burst out, but Swan had advised utter coolness, and finally she had agreed. They needed to see a woman in control of herself, not a girl being ridden by her heart. The words came from her heart, though. "You heard Arathel say she did not want to become entangled in Aes Sedai affairs, yet they were willing to bring an army into Murundi and stand in our way, because they are not certain who we are or what we are about. Did any of you feel that they truly believe you are sitters?" Malind, round-faced and fierce-eyed, shifted on her bench among the greens, and so did Salita, twitching her yellow-fringed shawl, though her dark face managed to hide any
Hey,
expression.
Bastion, how you doing?
Barana,
Just in
another
time
sitter
for a
chosen in
dab.
Salidar, frowned thoughtfully. Egwene did not mention
Hope
the
you're doing
reaction to
well.
her as Amerlin.
Dab of
If that thought was not already in their heads, she did not want
some
to fight
sugar
it.
wax.
We've listed Elida's crimes to countless nobles, she went on. We've told them we intend to remove her, but they doubt. They think that maybe we are what we say. And maybe there's a trick in our words.
Never have been into,
Perhaps
but
we
I
are
can't
only
complain
Elida's
though.
hand,
Well, you
weaving
can,
some
but you know
elaborate
how that
scheme.
goes.
Doubt leaves people floundering. Doubt gave Pelavar and Arathel the nerve to stand before Aes Sedai and say, "You cannot go further." Who else will stand in our way or interfere because they aren't certain, and uncertainty leads them to act in a cloud of confusion. There's only one way for us to dispel their confusion. We have already done everything else. Once we declare ourselves at war with Elida, there can be no doubts. I don't say that Arathel and Pelavar and Aemlyn will march away as soon as we do so, but they and everyone else will know who we are. No one will dare again to show doubt so openly when you say you are the Hall of the Tower. No one will dare stand in our way, meddling in the affairs of the Tower trying to prevent ignorance. We have walked to the door and put our hands on the latch. If you are afraid to walk through, then you all but ask the world to believe that you are nothing but Elida's puppets. She sat, surprised at how calm she felt. Beyond the 2 rows of sitters, sisters outside stirred, putting their heads together.
Pretty smooth,
she could imagine the excited murmurs that Ealdrin's ward blocked off. Now if only Takima kept her mouth shut long enough. Ramonda grunted impatiently and stood only long enough to say, "Who stands for declaring war against Elida?" Her gaze returned to Lelaine, and her cold, smug smile returned. It was clear what she considered important once this nonsense was done with. Janya rose immediately, the long brown fringe on her shawl swaying. "We might as well," she said. She was not supposed to speak, but her set jaw and sharp gaze dared anyone to calm her down. She was not normally so forceful, but as usual her words nearly tripped over one another. "Mending what the world knows won't be any harder than it is for this. Well, I don't see the point of waiting." On the other side of Takima, Esmeralda nodded. Moria all but bounded to her feet, frowning down at Lirella, who gathered her skirts as if to rise, then hesitated and looked at Lelaine questioningly. Lelaine was too busy frowning across the carpets at Ramonda to notice. Among the greens, Samalin and Malin stood together, and Faisella looked up with a jerk. A stocky, copper-skinned Domani, Faisella was not a woman startled by much, but she looked startled now, her square face swinging wide-eyed from Samalin to Malin and back. Salita rose, carefully adjusting the yellow fringe of her shawl, and just as carefully avoiding Ramonda's sudden frown. Quamesa stood, and then Ealdrin, drawing Barana up by her sleeve. Delana twisted completely around on her bench, peering at the sisters outside. Even in silence, the spectators' excitement communicated itself in constant shifting, heads going together, eyes darting toward the sitters. Delana rose slowly, both hands pressed to her middle, looking ready to sick up on the spot. Takima grimaced and stared at her hands on her knees. Soroya studied the other 2 white sitters, tugging at her ear the way she did when deep in thought. But no one else moved to stand. Egwene felt bile rising in her own throat. 10. Just 10. She had been so sure. Swan had been so sure. Loghain alone should have been enough, given their ignorance of the law involved. Pelavar's army and Arathel refusing to admit that they were sitters should have primed them like a pump. "For the love of the light!" Moria burst out. Rounding on Lirella and Lelaine, she planted her fists on her hips. If Janya's speaking had not gone against custom, this tied it in a knot. Displays of anger were strictly forbidden in the hall, but Moria's eyes blazed, and her Ilianer accent was thick with it. "Why do you wait? Elida did steal the stole and the staff. Elida's Aja did make Loghain a false dragon, and only the light knows how many other men. No woman in the history of the Tower did ever deserve this declaration more. Stand, or hold silent from now about your resolve to remove her." Lelaine did not quite stare, but by her expression you might have thought she had found herself attacked by a sparrow. This is hardly worth a vote, Moria, she said in a tight voice. We will speak later about decorum, you and I. Still, if you need a demonstration of resolve. With a sharp sniff, she rose and gave a jerk of her head that pulled Lirella up to her feet like strings. Lilane seemed surprised that it did not pull up Faisella and Takima, too. Far from standing, Takima grunted as if struck. Disbelief bright on her face, she ran her eyes along the women on their feet, obviously counting, and then did it again. Takima, who remembered everything the first time. Egwene breathed deep in relief. It was done. She could hardly believe. After a moment she cleared her throat, and Shiriam actually jumped. Green eyes as big as teacups, the keeper cleared her throat too. The lesser consensus standing, war is declared against Elida do Avrine Arroyhan. Her voice was none too steady, but it sufficed. In the interest of unity, I ask for the greater consensus to stand. Faisella half moved, then clenched her hands in her lap. Soroya opened her mouth, then closed it without speaking, her face troubled. No one else stirred. You won't get it, Romanda said flatly. The sneer she directed across the pavilion at Lilane was as good as a statement of why she, at least, would not stand. Now that little business is finished, we can go on with— I don't think we can, Egwene cut in. Takima, what does the law of war say about the Amerlin seat? Romanda was left with her mouth hanging open. Takima's lips writhed. The diminutive Brown looked more than ever a bird wishing to take flight. The law, she began, then took a deep breath and sat up straight. The law of war states, as one set of hands must guide a sword, so the Amerlin seat shall direct and prosecute the war by decree. She shall seek the advice of the Hall of the Tower, but the Hall shall carry out her decrees with all possible speed, and for the sake of unity, they shall— She faltered and had to visibly force herself to go on. They and must approve any decree of the Amerlin seat regarding prosecution of the war with the greater consensus. A long silence stretched. Every eye seemed to be goggling. Turning abruptly, Delana vomited onto the carpets behind her bench. Kwamesa and Salita both climbed down and started toward her, but she waved them off, plucking a scarf from her sleeve to wipe her mouth. Magla and Soroya and several others still seated looked as though they might follow her example. No others who had been chosen in Salidar, though. Romanda appeared ready to bite through a nail. Very clever, Lilane said at last in clipped tones, and after a deliberate pause added, Mother, will you tell us what the great wisdom of your vast experience tells you to do? About the war, I mean. I want to make myself clear. Let me make myself clear, too, Egwene said coldly. Leaning forward, she fixed the blue sitter sternly. A certain degree of respect is required toward the Amerlin seat, and from now on I will have it, daughter. This is no time for me to have to unchair you and name a penance. Lilane's eyes grew wider and wider with shock. Had the woman really believed everything would continue as before? Or after so long not daring to show more than the tiniest backbone, had Lilane simply believed she had none? Egwene really did not want to unchair her. The blues would almost certainly return the woman, and she still had to deal with the Hall on matters that could not be convincingly disguised as part of the war against Elida. From the corner of her eye, she saw a smile pass across Romanda's lips at seeing Lilane set down. Small profit if all she did was raise Romanda's stock with the others. That holds for everyone, Romanda, she said. If need be, Tiana can find 2 birches as easily as 1. Romanda's smile vanished abruptly. If I may speak, Mother, Takima said, rising slowly. She attempted a smile, but she still looked decidedly ill. I myself think you have begun well. There may be benefits to stopping here a month, or longer. Romanda's head jerked around to stare at her, but for once Takima did not appear to notice. Wintering here, we can avoid worse weather further north, and also plan carefully. There's an end to delays, daughter, Egwene cut in. No more dragging our feet. Would she be another Gera or another Shine? Either was still possible. In 1 month, we will travel from here. No, she was Egwene Alvier, and whatever the secret history of her faults and virtues, the light only knew. But they would be hers, not copies of some other woman's. In 1 month, we will begin the siege of Tar Valon. This time the silence was broken only by the sound of Takima weeping. Chapter 20. Into Andor. Elaine hoped that the journey to Caemlyn would go smoothly, and in the beginning it seemed to do so. She thought that, even as she and Avienda and Birgitta sat bone-weary and huddled in the rags that remained of their clothing, filthy with dirt and dust and the blood of the injuries they had received when the gateway exploded. In 2 weeks at most, she would be ready to present her claims to the Lion Throne. There on the hilltop, Nynaeve healed their numerous hurts and spoke barely a word, certainly not berating them. Surely that was a pleasant sign, if unusual. Relief at finding them alive battled worry on her face. Lan's strength was necessary to remove the Shanchan crossbow bolt from Birgitta's thigh before she could be healed of that wound, but although her face drained of blood, and Elaine felt a stab of agony through the bond, agony that made her want to cry out, her warder barely groaned through her gritted teeth. Taishar Kandor, Lan murmured, tossing the pile-head quarrel, made to punch through armor, aside on the ground. True blood of Kandor. Birgitta blinked, and he paused. Forgive me if I erred. I assumed from your clothes you were Kandori. Oh, yes, Birgitta breathed. Kandori. Her sickly grin might have been from her injuries. Nynaeve was impatiently shooing Lan out of the way so she could lay hands on her. Elaine hoped the woman knew more of Kandor than the name. When Birgitta had last been born, there had been no Kandor. She should have taken it as an omen. For the 5 miles to the small, slate-roofed manor house, Birgitta rode behind Nynaeve on the latter's stout brown mare, named Lover's Knot of all things, and Elaine and Avienda rode Lan's tall black stallion. At least Elaine sat Mandarb's saddle, with Avienda's arms around her waist, while Lan led the fiery-eyed animal. Trained warhorses were as much weapons as a sword, and dangerous mounts for strange riders. Be sure of yourself, girl, Linny had always told her, but not too sure, and she did try. She should have realized events were no more in her control than Mandarb's reins. At the 3-story stone house, Master Hornwell, stout and gray-haired, and Mistress Hornwell, slightly less round and slightly less gray, but otherwise resembling her husband remarkably, had every last person who worked the estates, and Marililla's maid Pole, and the green and white liveried servants who had come from the Tarasin Palace as well, all bustling to find sleeping accommodations for over 200 people, most women, who had appeared out of nowhere with dark near to falling. The work went with surprising swiftness, in spite of the estate's people stopping to gawk at an Aes Sedai ageless face, or a warder's shifting cloak making parts of him vanish, or one of the sea folk with all of her bright silks, her earrings and nose ring and medallion chain. Kinswomen were deciding that now it was safe to be frightened and cry no matter what Rihanna and the knitting circle said to them. Windfinders were snarling over how far from the salt they had come, against their will, as Renylid Callan loudly claimed, and nobles and craftswomen who had been all too willing to flee whatever lay back in Ebudar, willing to carry their bundled possessions on their backs, were now balking at being shown a hayloft for a bed. All that was going on when Elaine and the others arrived with the sun red on the western horizon, a great upheaval and milling all about the house and thatch-roofed outbuildings. But Alice Tengila, smiling pleasantly and implacable as an avalanche, seemed to have something more in hand than even the capable Hornwells. Kinswomen who wept harder for all of Rihanna's attempts at comfort dried their tears at a murmur from Alice, and began moving with the purposeful air of women who had been caring for themselves in a hostile world for many years. Haughty nobles, with marriage knives dangling into the oval cutouts in their lace-trimmed bodices, and craftswomen who displayed almost as much arrogance and nearly as much bosom, if not in silk, flinched at the sight of Elise approaching, and went scurrying for the tall barns, hugging their bundles, and announcing loudly that they had always thought it might be amusing to sleep on straw. Even the wind-finders, many of them important and powerful women among the Atha'an-Nier, muffled their complaints when Elise came near. For that matter, Saritha, still lacking the Aes Sedai agelessness, eyed Elise askance and touched her brown-fringed shawl, as if to remind herself it was there. Marililla, unflappable Marililla, watched the woman go about her work with a blend of approval and open amazement. Clambering down from her saddle at the front door of the house, Nynaeve glared toward Elise, gave her dark braid one deliberate, measured tug that the other woman was far too busy to notice, and stalked inside, stripping off her blue riding gloves and muttering to herself. Watching her go, Lan chuckled softly, then stifled his laughter immediately when Elaine dismounted. Light, but his eyes were cold. For Nynaeve's sake, she hoped the man could be saved from his fate, yet looking into those eyes she did not believe it. "Where is Ispan?" she murmured, helping Aviendha scramble down. So many of the women knew an Aes Sedai, a black sister, was being held prisoner, that the news was bound to spread through the estates like fire in dry grass, but better if the manor's folk had a little preparation. Adelius and Van Dien took her to a small woodcutter's hut about half a mile away, he replied just as quietly. In all this, I don't think anyone noticed a woman with a sack over her head. The sisters said they would stay there with her tonight. Elaine shivered. The dark friend was to be questioned again once the sun went down, it seemed. They were in Andor, and that made her feel more deeply as if she had given the order for it. Soon she was in a copper bathtub, luxuriating in perfumed soap and clean skin again, laughing and splashing water at Brigitte, who lolled in another tub, except when she was splashing back, both of them giggling over the wincing horror Aviendha could not quite conceal at sitting up to her breasts in water. She thought it was a very good joke on herself, though, and told a most improper story about a man getting cigada spines in his bottom. Brigitte told one still more improper about a woman having her head caught between the slats of a fence that made even Aviendha blush. They were funny. Elaine wished she knew one to tell. She and Aviendha combed and brushed one another's hair, a nightly ritual for near sisters, and then they snuggled tiredly into the canopied bed in a small room. She and Aviendha, Brigitte and Nynaeve, and lucky there were no more. Larger rooms had cots and pallets covering the floors, including the sitting rooms, the kitchens, and most of the halls. Nynaeve muttered half the night about the indecency of making a woman sleep apart from her husband, and for the other half her elbows seemed to wake Elaine every time she dropped off. Brigitte flatly refused to change places, and she could not ask Aviendha to endure the woman's sharp prodding, so she did not get a great deal of sleep. Elaine was still groggy when they prepared to depart the next morning, with the rising sun a molten ball of gold. The manor had few animals to spare unless she stripped the estates bare, so while she rode a black gelding named Fireheart, and Aviendha and Brigitte had new mounts, those who had been afoot when they fled the Kin's farm remained afoot. That included most of the kinswomen themselves, the servants leading the pack animals, and the 20-odd women who plainly were beyond regretting their visit to the Kin's farm in hopes of peace and contemplation. The warders rode ahead to scout the way across rolling hills covered in drought-starved forest, and the rest of them stretched out in a most peculiar snake, with Nynaeve and herself and the other sisters at the head, and Aviendha, of course. It was hardly a group that could escape notice, so many women traveling with so few men for guards, not to mention 20 dark wind-finders, awkward on their horses and as bright as exotically plumaged birds, and 9 Aes Sedai, 6 of them recognizably so to anyone who knew what to look for. Though one did ride with a leather sack over her head, of course, as if that would not attract eyes by itself. Elaine had hoped to reach Camelin unnoticed, but that no longer seemed possible. Still, there was no reason that anyone would suspect that the daughter heir, Elaine Trakand herself, was one of this group. In the beginning, she thought that the greatest difficulty they might face would be someone who opposed her claims, learning of her presence, sending armed men to try taking her into custody until the succession was settled. In truth, she expected the first trouble to come from the footsore craftswomen and nobles, proud women all, and none used to tramping dusty hills, especially since Marililla's maid had her own plump mare to ride. The few farm wives among them did not seem to mind too much, but nearly half their number were women who possessed lands and manors and palaces, and most of the rest could have afforded to buy an estate, if not two or three. They included 2 goldsmiths, 3 weavers who owned over 400 looms between them, a woman whose manufactories produced a tenth of all the lacquerware Ebu Dar produced, and a banker. They walked, their possessions strapped to their backs, while their horses bore pack saddles laden with food. There was real need. Every last coin in everyone's purse had been pulled together and given into Nynaeve's tight-fisted keeping, but all might not be sufficient to buy food, fodder, and lodgings for so large a party all the way to Camelin. They did not seem to understand. They complained loudly and incessantly through the first day's march. Loudest of all was a slim lady with a thin scar on one cheek, a stern-faced woman named Malian, who was nearly bent double under the weight of a huge bundle containing a dozen or more dresses and all the changes that went with them. When they made camp that first night, with their cook fires glowing in the twilight and everyone full of beans and bread, if not entirely satisfied with them, Malian gathered the noblewomen around her, their silks more than travel-stained. The craftswomen joined in too, and the banker and the farmers stood close. Before Malian could say a word, Rihanna strode into the group, her face full of smile lines in plain brown woolens, with her skirts sewn up on the left to expose bright layered petticoats. She might have been one of the farm women. "If you wish to go home," she announced in that surprisingly high voice, "you may do so at any time. I regret that we must keep your horses, though. You will be paid for them as soon as can be arranged. If you choose to remain, please remember that the rules of the farm still apply." A number of the women around her gaped. Malian was not alone in opening her mouth angrily. Alice just seemed to appear at Rihanna's side, fists planted on her hips. She was not smiling now. "I said the last 10 to be ready would do the washing up," she told them firmly, and she named them off. Gillian, a plump goldsmith, Nysella, the cool-eyed banker, and all 8 of the nobles. They stood staring at her until she clapped her hands and said, "Don't make me invoke the rule on failure to do your share of the chores." Malian, wide-eyed and muttering in disbelief, was the last to dart off and begin gathering dirty bowls. But the next morning she pared her bundle down, leaving lace-trimmed silk dresses and shifts to be trampled on the hillside as they departed. Elaine continued to expect an explosion, but Rihanna kept a firm hand on them, Elise kept a firmer, and if Malian and the others glared and muttered over the grease stains that grew on their clothes day by day, Rihanna had only to speak a few words to send them to their work. Elise only had to clap her hands. If the rest of the journey could have gone as smoothly, Elaine would have been willing to join those women in their greasy labors. Long before reaching Camelin, she knew that for a fact. Once they reached the first narrow, dusty road, little more than cart track, farms began to appear, thatched stone houses and barns clinging to the hillsides, or nestled in hollows. From then on, whether the land was hilly or flat, forested or cleared, they rarely spent many hours beyond sight of a farm or a village. At each of those, while the local folk goggled at the very strange strangers, Elaine tried to learn how much support House Trakand had, and what concerned the people most. Addressing those concerns would be important in making her claim to the throne strong enough to stand, as important as the backing of other houses. She heard a great deal, if not always what she wished to hear. Andorrans claimed the right to speak their minds to the Queen herself. They were hardly shy with a young noblewoman, no matter how peculiar her traveling companions. In a village called Demelian, where 3 mills sat beside a small river shrunken to leave their tall water wheels dry, the square-jawed innkeeper at the Golden Sheaves allowed as how he thought Morghese had been a good queen, the best that could be, the best that ever was. Her daughter might have been a good ruler too, I suppose, he muttered, thumbing his chin. Pity the dragon reborn killed them. I suppose he had to. The prophecies or some such. But he had no call to dry up the rivers, now did he? How much grain did you say your horses need, my lady? It's dreadful dear, mind. A hard-faced woman in a worn brown dress that hung on her as if she had lost weight surveyed a field surrounded by a low stone wall where the hot wind sent sheets of dust marching into the woods. The other farms around Berry Hill looked as bad or worse. That dragon reborn's got no right to do this to us. Now has he? I ask you. She spat and frowned up at Elaine in her saddle. The throne? Oh, Diolin's as good as any now Morghese and her girl are dead. Some around here still speak up for Nayan or Elenia, but I'm for Diolin. Any lookout, Canelin's a long way off. I've got crops to worry about, if I ever make another crop. Oh, it's true, my lady, so it is. Elaine's alive, a gnarled old carpenter told her in Forel Market. He was bald as a leather egg, his fingers twisted with age, but the work standing among the shavings and sawdust that littered his shop looked as fine as any Elaine had seen. She was the only person in the shop besides him. From the look of the village, half the residents had left. The dragon reborn is having her brought to Camelin so he can put the rose crown on her head himself, he allowed. The news is all over. Didn't right, if you ask me. He's one of them black-eyed Aiel men, I hear. We ought to march on Camelin and drive him and all them Aiel back where they come from. Then Elaine can claim the throne her own self, if Diolin lets her keep it anyway. Elaine heard a great deal about Rand, rumors ranging from him swearing fealty to Elida to him being the king of Ilion of all things. In Andor he was blamed for everything bad that happened for the last 2 or 3 years, including stillbirths and broken legs, infestations of grasshoppers, 2-headed calves, and 3-legged chickens. And even people who thought her mother had ruined the country and an end to the reign of House Trakand was good riddance still believed Rand al'Thor an invader. The dragon reborn was supposed to fight the Dark One at Sheol Ghul, and he should be driven out of Andor. Not what she had hoped to hear, not a bit of it, but she heard it all again and again. It was not a pleasant journey at all. It was one long lesson in one of Linny's favorite sayings. It isn't the stone you see that trips you on your nose. She thought a number of things beside the nobles might cause trouble, some sure to be explosions as great as the gateway. The Windfinders, smug in the bargain made with Nynaeve and herself, behaved in an irritatingly superior manner toward the Aes Sedai, especially after it came out that Marililla had let herself agree to be one of the first sisters to go the ships. Yet, if the sizzling there continued like the burning of an illuminator's fuse cord, the explosion never quite came. The Windfinders and the kinswomen, in particular the knitting circle, seemed as certain to blow up. They cut one another dead when not sneering openly, the kin at sea-folk wilders getting above themselves, the Windfinders at cringing sand-lappers kissing Aes Sedai feet. But it never went beyond lips curled or daggers caressed. Ispan certainly presented problems that Elaine was and hands still on her reins. Among the Atha'an Mier, a dark friend was her names as soon as proven guilty, then thrown over the side tied to ballast stones. Among the kinswomen, even Rihanna and Elise paled every time they saw the Tarabonner woman. But Ispan grew meeker and meeker, eager to please and full of ingratiating smiles for the 2 white-haired sisters, no matter what it was they did to her when they carried her away from the others at night. On the other hand, Adelius and Vandene grew more and more frustrated. Adelius told Nynaeve in Elaine's hearing that the woman spilled out volumes about old plots of the Black Ajah, Those she had not been involved in much more enthusiastically than those she was. Yet even when they pressed her hard, Elaine could not quite make herself ask how they pressed, and she let slip the names of dark friends. Most were certainly dead, and none was a sister. Van Deen said they were beginning to fear she had taken an oath. The capital was audible against betraying her cohorts. They continued to isolate Ispan as much as possible, and continued with their questions, but it was plain they were feeling their way blindly now, and carefully. And there was Nynaeve, and Lan. Most definitely Nynaeve and Lan, with her near to bursting at the effort of holding her temper around him, mooning over him when they had to sleep apart, which was nearly always the way accommodations divided up, and torn between eager and afraid when she could sneak him off to a hayloft. It was her own fault for choosing a sea-folk wedding in Elaine's estimation. The sea-folk believed in hierarchy as they did in the sea, and they knew a woman and her husband might be promoted one past the other many times in their lives. Their marriage rites took that into account. Whoever had the right to command in public must obey in private. Lan never took advantage, so Nynaeve said, "Not really," whatever that was supposed to mean. She always blushed when she said it, but she kept waiting for him to do so, and he just seemed to grow more and more amused. This amusement, of course, screwed Nynaeve's temper to a fever pitch. Nynaeve did erupt, out of all the explosions Elaine had expected. She snapped at anyone and everyone who got in her way, except at Lan. With him she was all honey and cream, and not at Elise. She came close once or twice, but even Nynaeve could not seem to make herself snap at Elise. Elaine had hopes, not worries, about the things brought out of the Rahad along with the Bowl of the Winds. Avienda helped her search, and so did Nynaeve once or twice, but she was entirely too slow and ginger about it and showed little skill in finding what they were searching for. They found no more Angreal, yet the collection of Terangreal grew once all the rubbish had been thrown away. Objects that used the one power filled 5 entire panniers on the pack horses. Careful as Elaine was, though, her attempt to study them did not go so well. Spirit was the safest of the 5 powers to use in this, unless, of course, spirit happened to be what triggered the thing. Yet at times she had to use other flows, as fine as she could weave. Sometimes her delicate probing did nothing, but her first touch at the thing that looked like a blacksmith's puzzle made of glass left her dizzy and unable to sleep for half the night. And a thread of fire touching what looked like a helmet made of fluffy metal feathers gave everyone within 20 paces a blinding headache, except for herself. And then there was the crimson rod that felt hot, hot in a way. Sitting on the edge of her bed at an inn called the Wild Boar, she examined the smooth rod by the light of 2 polished brass lamps. Wrist thick and a foot long, it looked like stone, but felt firm rather than hard. She was alone. Since the helmet, she had tried to do her studying away from the others. The heat of the rod made her think of fire. Blinking, she opened her eyes and sat up in the bed. Sunlight streamed in at the window. She was in her shift, and Nynaeve, fully dressed, stood frowning down at her. Avienda and Brigitte were watching from beside the door. "What happened?" Elaine demanded, and Nynaeve shook her head grimly. "You don't want to know." Her lips twitched. Avienda's face gave away nothing. Brigitte's mouth might have been a little tight, but the strongest emotion Elaine felt from her was a combination of relief and hilarity. The woman was doing her utmost not to roll on the floor laughing. The worst of it was, no one would tell what had happened, what she had said or done. She was sure it was that, by the quickly hidden grins she saw, from kinswomen and windfinders as well as sisters, but no one would tell her. After that, she decided to leave studying the Terangreal to somewhere more comfortable than an inn, somewhere definitely more private. 9 days after their flight from Ebu Dar, scattered clouds appeared in the sky, and a sprinkling of fat raindrops splashed
Hey,
dust
just
in the
chilling.
wind.
How you
An
doing?
intermittent drizzle fell the next day, and the day
Hope you're
after a
doing
deluge
well.
kept them huddled in the houses and stables of Forel Market. That night the rain turned to sleet, and by morning thick flurries of snow drifted from a cloud-dark sky. More than halfway to Camelin, Elaine began to wonder whether they could make it in 2 weeks from where they stood. With the snow, clothes became a worry. Elaine blamed herself for not thinking of the fact that everyone might need warm clothes before they reached their destination. Nynaeve blamed herself for not thinking of it. Marillilla thought she was at fault, and Rihanna thought she was. They actually stood in the main street of Forel Market that morning with snowflakes drifting down on their heads, arguing over who could claim the blame. Elaine was not sure which of them saw the absurdity first, who was the first to laugh, but all were laughing as they settled around the table in the White Swan to decide what to do. A solution turned out to be no laughing matter. Providing one warm coat or cloak for everyone would take a large bite out of their coin, if so many could be found. Jewelry could be
Yeah, yeah.
sold or traded, of course, but no one in
I
Forel
can't
Market
complain,
seemed to
man.
be interested in necklaces or bracelets, however fine. Avienda solved that difficulty by producing a small sack that bulged with clear, perfect gemstones, some quite large. Strangely, the same folk who had said with bare politeness that they had no use for begemmed necklaces went round-eyed at the unset stones rolling about in Avienda's palm. Rihanna said they saw one as frippery, the other as wealth. But whatever their reasons, in return for 2 rubies of moderate size, one large moonstone, and a small fire drop, the people of Forel Market were more than willing to provide as many thick woolens as their visitors desired, some of them hardly worn. Very generous of them, Nynaeve muttered sourly as people began rooting clothes out of their chests and attics. A steady stream marched into the inn with their arms full. Those stones could buy the whole village. Avienda shrugged slightly. She would have surrendered a handful of the gems if Rihanna had not intervened. Marillilla shook her head. We have what they want, but they have what we need. I'm afraid that means they set the price. Which was entirely too much like the situation with the sea folk.
Okay,
Nynaeve
let me
looked
get one made
positively
out.
ill. When they were alone in a hallway of the inn, Elaine asked Avienda where she had gotten such a fortune in jewels, and one she seemed eager to be rid of. She expected her near sister to say they were her takings from the Stone of Tyr, or perhaps Kyrian. Randall Thor tricked me, Avienda muttered sullenly. I tried to buy my toque from him. I know that is the least honorable way, she protested, but I could see no other. And he stood me on my head. Why is it when you reason things out logically, a man always does something completely illogical and gains the upper hand? Their pretty heads are so fuzzy, a woman can't expect to follow how they skitter, Elaine told her. She did not inquire what to Avienda had tried to buy, or how the attempt had ended with her near sister possessing a sack full of rich gems. Talking about Rand was hard enough without where that might lead. Snow brought more than a need for warm clothing. At midday, with the snow flurries falling thicker by the minute, Renila strode down the stairs into the common room, proclaimed that her part of the bargain had been met, and
Hell yeah,
demanded
just
not only the
chilling.
bowl of the winds, but Marillilla. The Grey Sisters stared in consternation, and so did a great many others. The benches were filled with kinswomen taking their turn at the midday meal, and serving men and women ran to serve this third lot of meals. Renila did not keep her voice down, and every head in the common room swiveled toward her. You can begin your teaching now, Renila told the wide-eyed Aes Sedai. Up the ladder with you to my quarters. Marillilla started to protest, but face suddenly cold, the Windfinder to the mistress of the ships planted fists on her hips. When I give a command, Marillilla Cian Devon, she said icily, I expect every hand on deck to jump. Now jump. Marillilla did not precisely jump, but she did gather herself and go, with Renila practically chivying her up the stairs from behind. Given her promise, she had no other choice. Rihanna's face was aghast. Alice and stout Sumiko, still wearing her red belt, watched thoughtfully. In the days that followed, whether laboring along a snow-covered road on their horses, walking the streets of a village, or trying to find room for everyone at a farm, Renila kept Marililla at her heels, except when she told her off to follow another wind-finder. The glow of Sidar surrounded the brave sister and her escort almost constantly, and Marililla demonstrated Weave's own. The pale Kyrianan was markedly shorter than any of the dark seafolk women,
Whenever I get
but at
around to
first
buying it,
Marililla managed to stand taller by the sheer force of Aes Sedai dignity. Soon, though, she began to wear a permanently startled expression. Elaine learned that when they all had beds to sleep in, which they did not always, Marililla was sharing with Paul, her maid, and the two apprentice windfinders, Kalan and Metara. What that said of Marililla's status, Elaine was not
because
sure.
the books I play, I
Clearly,
actually
the
buy them
windfinders did not put her on a level
unless
with the
they're the
apprentices. They
ones in the
just
public
expected her to
domain.
do as she was told, when she
But
was
if it's
told,
these ones
with
like
no
this, and like
delays
how
or
the Godfather
equivocations.
would be, or I'd have to
Rihanna
actually
remained
purchase that
appalled
one.
at the turn of events, but Elise and Sumiko were not the only ones among the kin to watch closely, not the only ones to nod thoughtfully. And suddenly another problem came to Elaine's notice. The kinswoman saw Ispan made more and more
My
malleable in her captivity,
little
but she
Dr.
was the
Dabber
prisoner of
excess,
other
or
Aes Sedai.
as I
The
call it,
Seafolk were
my
not
mini
Aes
Dr.
Sedai,
Dabber,
and Marililla not a prisoner, yet she
and
was
it still
starting to
rips
jump
pretty
when
good.
Renila issued a command, or for that matter when Dorilla or Kyra's blood sister Tirella did. Each of those was Windfinder's or clan wave mistress, and none of the others made her hop with such alacrity, but that was enough. More and more of the kin slid from horrified gaping to thoughtful observation. Perhaps Aes Sedai were not a different flesh after all. If Aes Sedai were just women like themselves, why should they
If
subject
one's,
themselves
well, I
once
bought it
more
off
to the rigors of the tower, to Aes
one
Sedai
my
authority and
younger
Aes
brother,
Sedai
but
discipline?
he got it
Had
from
they not survived very
one of the
well on
local
their own,
shops here.
some for more years than any of the older sisters were quite ready to believe? Elaine could practically see the idea forming in their heads. When she mentioned it to Nynaeve, though, Nynaeve just muttered, "About time some of the sisters learned what it's like trying to teach a woman who thinks she knows more than her teacher. Those who have a chance at a shawl will still want it. And for the rest, I don't see why they shouldn't grow some backbone." Elaine refrained from mentioning Nynaeve's complaints about Sumiko, who had certainly grown backbone. Sumiko had criticized several of Nynaeve's healing weaves as clumsy, and Elaine had thought Nynaeve was going to have apoplexy on the spot. In any case, there's no need to tell Egwene about this, if she's there. Any of it. She has enough on her plate. Without doubt, any of it referred to Marililla and the Windfinders. They were in their shifts, seated on their bed on the second floor of the new plough, with the twisted ring dream ter'angreal hanging about their necks, Elaine's on a simple leather cord, Nynaeve's alongside Lan's heavy signet ring on a narrow golden chain. Avienda and Brigitte, still fully dressed, sat on two of their clothing chests. Standing guard, they called it, until she and Nynaeve returned from the world of dreams. Both wore their cloaks until they could climb under the blankets.
Oh yeah.
The new plough was definitely not new. Cracks spidered across the plastered walls, and unfortunate
Especially as old
drafts
as it
crept
is,
in
it's
everywhere.
definitely a good
The
one to
room
watch like
itself was
that.
small, and the chests and stacked bundles left room for little beyond the bed and washstand. Elaine knew
Excuse
she
me.
had to present herself properly in Camelin, but sometimes she felt guilty, with her belongings on pack animals, when most others had to make do with what they could carry on their backs. Nynaeve certainly never showed any regrets over her chests. They had been 16 days on the road. The full moon outside the narrow window shone on a white blanket of snow that would make traveling tomorrow slow, even if the sky remained clear, and Elaine thought another week to Camelin was an optimistic estimate. "I have enough sense not to remind her," she told Nynaeve. "I don't want my nose snapped off again." That was a mild way of putting it. They had not been in Tel Eiranriad since informing Egwene, the night after leaving the estate, that the bowl had been used. Reluctantly, they also had told her of the bargain they had been forced into with the Seafolk, and found themselves facing the Amerlin's seat, with the striped stole on her shoulders. Elaine knew it was necessary and right. A queen's closest friend among her subjects knew she was the queen as well as a friend. Had to know. But she had not enjoyed her friend telling them in a heated voice that they had behaved like witless lubies who might have brought ruin down on all their heads, especially when she herself agreed. She had not liked hearing that the only reason Egwene did not set them both a penance
I
that
don't
would
know.
curl their hair was that she could not afford to have them waste the
That's a good
time.
question.
Necessary and right, though. When she sat on the lion throne, she would still be Aes Sedai, and subject to the laws and rules and customs of Aes Sedai. Not for Andor. She would not give her land to the White Tower, but for herself. So, unpleasant as it had been, she accepted her castigation calmly. Nynaeve had writhed and stammered with embarrassment, protested and all but pouted, then apologized so profusely that Elaine hardly believed it was the same woman she knew. Quite rightly, Egwene had remained the Amyrlin, cool in her displeasure, even while giving pardon for their mistakes. At best, tonight could not be pleasant or comfortable if she was there. But when they dreamed themselves into the corridor of Tel'aran'rhiod, Riyadh, into the room in the little tower that had been called the Amyrlin's study, she was not there, and the only sign she had visited since their meeting was some barely visible words, roughly scratched
No
on a
damn.
beetle-riddled wall
Those are
panel,
probably
as if by an
expensive
idle
too.
hand that did not want to spend the effort to carve deeply. Stay in Camelin, and a few feet away. Keep silent and be careful. Those had been Egwene's final instructions to them.
And I don't think I've
Go to
seen
Camelin
those.
and stay there until she could puzzle out how to keep
Might
the
have to
Hall
look
from
those up
salting all
after
of them
this.
down and nailing them into a barrel. A reminder they had no way to erase. Embracing Saidar, Elaine channeled to leave her own message, the number 15 seemingly scratched on the heavy table that had been Egwene's writing desk. Inverting the weave and tying it off meant that only someone who ran her fingers across the numerals would realize they were not really there. Perhaps it would not take 15 days to reach Camelin, but more than a week, she was certain. Nynaeve strode to the window and peered out both ways, careful not to put her head out through the open casement. It was night out there as in the waking world, a full moon gleaming on bright snow, though the air did not feel cold. No one else should be there except them, and if anyone was, it was someone to avoid. I hope she isn't having trouble with her plans, she muttered. She told us not to mention those even to each other, Nynaeve. A secret spoken finds wings. That had been another of Linny's many favorites. Nynaeve grimaced over her shoulder, then returned to peering down the narrow alley. It's different for you. I tended her as a child, changed her swaddling, smacked her bottom a time or two, and now I have to leap when she snaps her fingers. It's hard.
I don't know.
Elaine could not help
I
herself.
always liked
She
reading,
snapped her
and
fingers. Nynaeve
I guess
spun
it just
so
came
fast that
natural.
she
Used to have
blurred,
an
her face
audiobook.
pop-eyed with horror. Her dress blurred
Reading
too,
is
from blue
relaxing,
riding silks to an
but if you
accepted
actually sitting there
banded white,
chilling and
to what she
smoking,
referred to
actually
as
listening
good
to it's
stout Two
relaxing.
Rivers wool, dark
I guess
and
that's
thick.
how I got
When
into
she
it. Just
realized Egwene was
another
not
way to
there, had
relax,
not been listening, she almost
and I
fainted
guess a
with relief.
tad laziness
When they
into it
stepped
too, to
back to
where
their bodies and
I
woke
don't have
long
to sit
enough to
there
tell
and
the
read
others
it.
they could come to
I can
bed,
actually sit back,
Avienda certainly
close
thought
my
it a good
eyes,
joke, and
smoke,
Brigitte laughed as
and try to
well.
picture all this
Nynaeve had her revenge,
in my
though.
own
The next
imagination,
morning
I
she
guess you
woke
could say.
Elaine with an icicle. Elaine's shrieks woke everybody else in the whole village. 3 days later, the first explosion came.
No, I got into reading way before
Answering the
that.
summons.
I've been
The
reading
great
since I
winter
was a little
tempest called
kid.
the Samaros continued to roll up out of the sea of storms, harsher than any in memory. Some said this year the Samaros were trying to make up for the months of delay. Lightning crackled across the skies, enough to make the darkness patchy at night. Wind lashed the land and rain flailed it, turning all but the hardest roads to rivers of mud. Sometimes the mud froze after nightfall, but sunrise always brought a thaw, even under a gray sky, and the ground became bogs once more. Rand was surprised at how much all that hampered his plans.
Yeah, that
The
would be
Ashaman he had sent
relaxing.
for came quickly
I've
at
always
mid-morning
wanted
the
to
next
do
day,
that.
riding out of a gateway into a driving downpour that obscured the sun so that it might as well have been twilight. Through the hole in the air, snow fell
Especially
back
gets
in
to be
Andor, fat white flakes
peaceful
swirling
and
about
quiet.
thickly and hiding what lay behind them. Most of the men in the short column were bundled in heavy black cloaks, but the rain seemed to slip around them and their horses. It was not obvious, yet anyone who noticed would look twice, if not 3 times. Keeping dry required only a simple weave, so long as you did not mind flaunting what you were. But then, the black and white disc worked on a crimson circle on the breast of their cloaks did that. Even half hidden by the rain, there was a pride about them, an arrogance in the way they sat their saddles, a defiance. They gloried in what they were. Their commander, Charles Gedwin, was a few years older than Rand, of middling height and wearing the sword and dragon like Torvald, on a very well-cut, high-collared coat of black silk. His sword was mounted lushly with silver, his silver-worked sword belt fastened with a silver buckle shaped in a clenched fist. Gedwin termed himself Thorovan Mahale, in the old tongue, Storm Leader, whatever that was supposed to mean. It seemed appropriate to the weather, at least. Even so, he stood just inside the entrance to Rand's ornate green tent and scowled out at the cascading rain. A guard of mounted companions encircled the tent, no more than 30 paces away, yet they were barely visible. They might have been statues, ignoring the torrent. "How do you expect me to find anyone in this?" Gedwin muttered, glancing back over his shoulder at Rand. A tick late, he added, "My Lord Dragon." His eyes were hard and challenging, but they always were, whether looking at a man or a fence post. "Rothschild and I brought 8 dedicated and 40 soldiers, enough to destroy an army, or cow, 10 kings. We might even make an Aes Sedai blink," he said wryly. "Burn me, the pair of us could do a fair job alone, or you could. Why do you need anyone else?" "I expect you to obey, Gedwin," Rand said coldly. "Storm Leader." And Manal Rothschild, Gedwin's second, called himself Bajan Mahale, Attack Leader. What was Taim up to, creating new ranks? The important thing was that the man made weapons. The important thing was that the weapons stayed sane long enough to be used. "And I don't expect you to waste time questioning my orders." "As you command, my Lord Dragon," Gedwin muttered. "I'll send men out immediately." With a curt salute, fist to chest, he strode out into the storm. The deluge bent away from him, sheeting down the small shield he wove around himself. Rand wondered whether the man suspected how close he had come to dying when he seized Saladin without warning. "You must kill him before he kills you," Lews Therin giggled. "They will, you know. Dead men can't betray anyone." The voice in Rand's head turned wondering. "But sometimes they don't die. Am I dead? Are you?" Rand pushed the words down to a fly's buzzing, just on the edge of notice. Since his reappearance inside Rand's head, Lews Therin seldom went silent unless forced. The man seemed madder than ever most of the time, and usually angrier as well. Stronger sometimes, too. That voice invaded Rand's dreams, and when he saw himself in a dream, it was not always himself at all that he saw. It was not always Lews Therin either, the face he had come to recognize as Lews Therin's. Sometimes it was blurred, yet vaguely familiar, and Lews Therin seemed startled by it too. That was an indication how far the man's madness went, or maybe his own. "Not yet," Rand thought. "I can't afford to go mad yet." "When then?" Lews Therin whispered before Rand could mute him again. With the arrival of Gedwin and the Ashaman, his plan to sweep the Shonchan westward got underway. And crept forward as slowly as a man laboring along one of those mired roads. He shifted his own camp at once, making no effort to hide his movements. There was little point to straining for secrecy. Word traveled slowly by pigeon and far slower by courier once the Samaros came, yet he had no doubts he was watched, by the White Tower, by the Forsaken, by anyone who saw gain or loss in where the Dragon Reborn went, and could afford to slip coin to a soldier. Maybe even by the Shonchan. If he could scout them, why not they him? But not even the Ashaman knew why he was moving. While Rand was idly watching men fold his tent onto a high-wheeled cart, Wyraman appeared on one of his many horses, a prancing white gelding of the finest type of blood. The rain had cleared, though gray clouds still veiled the noonday sun, and the air felt as if you could squeeze water out of it with your hands. The dragon banner and the banner of light hung limp and sodden on their tall staffs. Tyrant defenders had replaced the companions, and as Wyraman rode through their mounted ring, he frowned at Radrivar Tihera, a lean fellow, dark even for a tyrant, with a short beard trimmed to a very sharp point. A very minor noble who had had to rise through his abilities, Tihera was punctilious in the extreme. The fat white plumes bobbing on his rimmed helmet added embellishment to the elaborate bow he gave Wyraman. The High Lord's frown deepened. There was no need for the captain of the stone to be personally in charge of Rand's bodyguard, but he frequently was, just as Marklin often commanded the companions himself. An often bitter rivalry had grown up between defenders and companions, centering on who should guard Rand. The Tyrants claimed the right because he had ruled longer in Tyr, the Illianers because he was, after all, King of Ilion. Perhaps Wyraman had heard some of the mutters among the defenders that it was time Tyr had a king of its own, and who better than the man who had taken the stone? Wyraman more than agreed with the need, but not with the choice of who should wear the crown. He was not the only one. The man smoothed his features as soon as he saw Rand looking, and swung down from his gold-tooled saddle to offer a bow that made Tihera's seem simple. Iron-spined as he was, he could puff up and strut in his sleep, though he did grimace slightly at putting his polished boot into the mud. He wore a rain cape to keep the mist off his fine clothes, but even that was encrusted with gold embroidery and had a collar of sapphires. For all of Rand's coat of deep green silk with golden bees climbing the sleeves and lapels, anyone might have been forgiven for thinking the crown of swords belonged on the other's head, not his. "My Lord Dragon," Wyraman intoned, "I cannot express how happy I am to see you guarded by tyrants, my Lord Dragon. Surely the world would weep if anything untoward happened." He was too intelligent to come out and call the companions untrustworthy. By a hair, he was. "Sooner or later it would," Rand said dryly, after a good part of it finished celebrating. "I know how hard you'd cry, Wyraman." The fellow actually preened, stroking the point of his gray-streaked beard. He heard what he wanted to hear. "Yes, my Lord Dragon, you can be assured of my constancy, which is why I'm concerned by the orders your man brought me this morning." That was Adley. Many of the nobles thought pretending the Ashaman were merely Rand's servants would somehow make them less dangerous. "Wise of you to send away most of the Kyrianan, and the Illianers, of course. That goes without saying. I can even understand why you limit Gwayam and the others." Wyraman's boots squelched in the mud as he stepped nearer, and his voice took on a confiding tone. "I do believe some of them, I wouldn't say plotted against you, but I think perhaps their loyalty has not always been without question. As mine is, without question." His voice shifted again to strong and confident, a man concerned only with the needs of the one he served, the one who surely would make him the first king of Tyr. "Allow me to bring all of my armsmen, my Lord Dragon. With them and the defenders, I can assure the honor of the Lord of the Morning and his safety." In all of the individual camps across the heath, wagons and carts were being loaded, horses saddled. Most tents were already down. The High Lady Rosanna was riding north, her banner heading a column large enough to raise havoc among the bandits and at least give the Shido pause, but not enough to plant notions in her head, especially not when half were Gwayam's and Marikan's retainers mixed with defenders of the stone. Much the same applied to Spira Naratan, riding eastward over the tall ridge with as many companions and men sworn to the others of the Council of Nine as his own liegemen, not to mention 100 more tailing behind on foot, some of the fellows who had surrendered in the woods beyond that ridge the day before. A surprising number had chosen to follow the Dragon Reborn, but Rand did not trust them enough to leave them together. Tolmaran was just starting south with the same kind of blend, and others would be marching off as soon as they had their carts and wagons loaded, each in a different direction, and none able to trust the men at their backs far enough for them to do more than follow the orders Rand had given. Bringing peace to Ilion was an important task, yet every last lord and lady regretted being sent away from the Dragon Reborn, plainly wondering whether it meant they had slipped in his trust. Though a few might have considered why he chose to keep those he did under his eye, Rosanna had certainly looked thoughtful. "Your concern touches me," Rand told Wyraman, "but how many bodyguards does one man need? I'm not off to start a war." A fine point, perhaps, yet this war was well underway. It had begun at Falma, if not before. "Get your people ready." "How many have died for my pride?" Luce Theron moaned. "How many have died for my mistakes?" "May I at least ask where we are going?" Wyraman's question, not quite exasperated, came right atop the voice in Rand's head. "The city," Rand snapped. He did not know how many had died for his mistakes, but none for his pride. He was sure of that. Wyraman opened his mouth, plainly confused as to whether he meant Tyr or Ilion, or maybe even Kyrian. But Rand gestured him away with the dragon scepter, a sharp stabbing motion that made the green and white tassel swing. He half wished he could stab Luce Theron with it. "I don't intend to sit here all day, Wyraman. Go to your men." Less than an hour later, he took hold of the true source and prepared to make a gateway for traveling. He had to fight the dizziness that gripped him lately whenever he seized or loosed the power. He did not quite sway in Tidashar's saddle. What with the molten filth floating on Saidine, the frozen slime, touching the source came close to emptying his stomach. Seeing double, even for only a few moments, made weaving flows difficult, if not impossible, and he could have told Deshiva or Flynn or one of the others to do it, but Gedwin and Rochide were holding their horses' reins in front of a dozen or so black-coated soldiers, all who had not been out to search. Just standing there patiently and watching Rand. Rochide, no more than a hand shorter than Rand and maybe 2 years younger, was also full Ashaman, and his coat too was silk. A small smile played on his face, as if he knew things others did not, and was amused. What did he know? About the Shonchan, surely, if not Rand's plans for them. What else? Maybe nothing, but Rand was not about to show any weakness in front of that pair. The dizziness faded quickly, the twins sighed a little more slowly, as it always did these last few weeks, and he completed the weave, then, without waiting, dug in his heels and rode through the opening that unfolded before him. The city he had meant was Ilion, though the gateway opened to the north of that city. Despite Wyraman's supposed concerns, he hardly went unprotected and alone. Nearly 3,000 men rode through that tall square hole in the air, into rolling meadow land, not far from the broad muddy road that led down to the causeway of the Northern Star. Even when every lord had only been allowed a handful of armsmen, to men accustomed to leading 1,000, if not thousands, were a handful. They added up. Tyrans and Kyrianen and Ilioners, defenders of the stone under Tihera, and companions under Markelin, Ashaman healing Gedwin. The Ashaman who was the way, Deshiva and Flynn and Dred kept their horses close behind Rand. All but Narishma. Narishma had not come back yet. The man knew where to find him, but Rand did not like it. Each kind kept to themselves as much as possible. Quayam and Marakan and Arakom rode with Wyraman, all eyeing Rand more than where they were going. And Bregar and Panar, with 3 others of the Council of the Nine, leaning in their saddles to speak softly and uneasily among themselves. Samaradrid, with a knot of tight-faced Kyrianen lords behind him, watched Rand almost as closely as the Tyrants did. Rand had chosen those who came with him as carefully as those he sent away, not always for the reasons others might have used. Had there been any onlookers, it would have been a brave display, with all their bright banners and pennants, and small Khan rising from some of the Kyrianen's backs. Bright and brave and very dangerous. Some had plotted against him, and he had learned that Samaradrid's House Maravin had old alliances with House Riotan, which stood in open rebellion against him in Kyrian. Samaradrid did not deny the connection, but he had not mentioned it before Rand heard either. The Council of Nine were just too new to him to risk leaving them all behind, and Wyraman was a fool. Left to his own devices, he might well try to gain the Lord Dragon's favor by marching an army with Shonchan, or Murundi, or the light alone knew who or where. Too stupid to leave behind, too powerful to shove aside, so he rode with Rand, and thought himself honored. It was almost a pity he was not stupid enough to do something that would get him executed. Behind came the servants and carts. No one understood why Rand had sent all of the wagons with the others, and he was not about to explain. Who owned the next pair of ears that would hear? And in the long strings of spare mounts, led by horse handlers, and straggling files of men in battered breastplates that did not or leather jerkins sewn with steel discs, carrying bows or crossbows or spears, and even a few pikes. More of the fellows who had obeyed Lord Bren's summons and decided against going home unarmed. Their leader was the runny-nosed man Rand had spoken to on the edge of the woods, Egan Padros by name, and much brighter than he looked. It was difficult for a commoner to rise very far most places, but Rand had marked Padros out. The fellow gathered his men off to one side, but the whole lot of them milled about, elbowing one another aside for a better view southward. The causeway of the Northern Star stretched arrow straight through the miles of brown marsh that surrounded Ilion, a wide road of hard-packed dirt broken by flat stone bridges. A wind from the south carried sea salt and a hint of tanneries. Ilion was a sprawling city, easily as large as Camelin or Kyrian. Brightly colored roof tiles and hundreds of thrusting towers gleaming in the sun were just visible across that sea of grass, where long-legged cranes waited and flocks of white birds flew low, uttering shrill cries. Ilion had never needed walls, not that walls would have done the city any good against him. There was considerable disappointment that he did not mean to enter Ilion, though no one spoke a complaint, at least not where he could hear. Still, there were plenty of glum faces and sour mutters as hasty camps began going up. Like most of the great cities, Ilion had a name for exotic mystery, free-handed tapsters, and willing women, at least among men who had never been there, even when it was their own capital. Ignorance always inflated a city's reputation for such things. As it was, only more galloped off across the causeway, then straightened from hammering tent pegs or setting picket lines for the horses, and followed him with jealous eyes. Nobles watched curiously, while trying to pretend they were not. The Ashaman with Gedwin paid more no mind, as they made their own tent, which consisted of a pitch-black tent for Gedwin and Rochide, and a space where damp brown grass and mud were squeezed flat and dry, for the rest to sleep wrapped in their cloaks. That was done with the power, of course. They did everything with the power, not even bothering to build cook fires. After many other camps stared at them, the tent seemed to spring up of its own accord, and hampers floated away from pack saddles. But most looked anywhere else at all once they realized what was going on. 2 or 3 of the black-coated soldiers appeared to be talking to themselves. Flynn and the others did not join Gedwin's lot. They had a pair of tents that went up not far from Rand's, but Dashiva wandered over to where the storm leader and the attack leader were standing at their and occasionally without order. A few words, and he wandered back, shaking his head and muttering angrily under his breath. Gedwin and Rochide were not a friendly pair. As well they were not. Rand took to his tent
Hey,
as soon as
Pierre,
it
how you
pitched,
doing?
and sprawled fully clothed on his cot, staring at the sloped ceiling. There were bees embroidered on the inside as well, on a false roof made of silk. Hopwill brought a steaming pewter mug of mulled wine. Rand had left his servants behind, but the wine grew cold on his writing table. His mind worked feverishly. 2 or 3 more days, and Shan-Chan would have been dealt a blow that knocked them on their heels. Then it was back to Kyrian to see how negotiations with the sea folk had gone, to learn what Cadswain was after. He owed her a debt, but she was after something. Maybe to put a final end to what remained of the rebellion there. Had Caroline Damadred and Darlin Cisnera slipped away in the confusion? The High Lord Darlin in his hands might finish the rebellion in Tyr as well.
At least you're doing good.
Andor.
my
If Matt and
dad's
Elaine
your
were
back.
in
Can't
Muir
complain now.
appeared, it would be weeks more at best.
Well, I
before
can,
Elaine
but
could claim the line.
you know how that shit goes.
Once that happened, he would have to stay clear of Gamelin. But he had to talk to Nynaeve. Could he cleanse Saidin? It might work. It might destroy the world, too. Lews Therin gibbered at him in stark terror. Light. Where was Narishma? A Cimaros storm swept in, all the fiercer this near the sea. Rain beat his tent like a drum. Lightning flashes filled the entrance with blue-white light, and thunder rumbled, a sound like mountains tumbling across the land. Out of that, Narishma stepped into the tent, dripping wet, dark hair plastered to his head. His orders had been to avoid notice at all costs. No flaunting for him. His sodden coat was plain white, and his dark hair was tied back, not braided. Even without bells, near waist-length hair on a man attracted eyes. He wore a scowl, too, and under his arm he carried a cylindrical bundle, tied with cord, fatter than a man's leg, like a small carpet. Springing from the cot, Rand snatched the bundle before Narishma could proffer it. "Did anyone see you?" he demanded. "What took you so long? I expected you last night." "It took a while to figure out what I had to do," Narishma replied in a flat voice. "You didn't tell me everything. You nearly killed me." That was ridiculous. Rand had told him everything he needed to know. He was sure of it. There was no point in trusting the man as far as he had, only to have him die and ruin everything. Carefully, he tucked the bundle beneath his cot. His hands trembled with the urge to strip the wrappings away, to make sure they held what Narishma had been sent for. The man would not have dared return if they did not. "Get yourself into a proper coat before you join the others," he said. "And Narishma?" Rand straightened, fixing the other man with a steady gaze. "You tell anyone about this, and I will kill you." "Kill you?" Luz Theron, a moan of derision, of despair. "I killed the world, and you can too if you try hard." Narishma struck himself hard in the chest with his fist. "As you command, my Lord Dragon," he said sourly. Bright and early the next morning, 1,000 men of the Legion of the Dragon marched out of Ilion, across the causeway of the Northern Star, stepping to the steady beat of drums. Well, it was early anyway. Thick gray clouds roiled across the sky, and a stiff sea breeze, sharp with salt, whipped cloaks and banners, muttering of another storm on the way. The Legion attracted a good bit of attention from the armsmen already in the camp, with their blue-painted Andoran helmets and their long blue coats worked on the chest with a red and gold dragon. A blue pennant bearing the dragon and a number marked each of the 5 companies. The Legion men were different in many ways. For instance, they wore breastplates, but beneath their coats so as not to hide the dragons, the same reason the coats buttoned up one side. And every man carried a short sword at his hip and a steel-armed crossbow. Everyone shouldered exactly the same as every other. The officers walked, each with a tall red plume on his helmet, just ahead of Drum and Pennant. The only horses were Moore's mouse-colored gelding at their head, and pack animals at the rear. "Foot," Byerman muttered, slapping his reins on a gauntleted hand. "Burn my soul, they're no good, Foot. They'll scatter at the first charge. Before." The first of the column strode off the causeway. They had helped take Ilion, and they had not scattered. Samaradrid shook his head. "No pikes," he muttered. "I have seen well-led Foot hold with pikes, but without—" He made a sound of disgust in his throat. Gregorin Panar, the third man sitting his saddle near Rand to watch the new arrivals, said nothing. Perhaps he had no prejudice against infantry, though if he did not, he would be one of only a handful of noblemen Rand had met without it. But he tried hard not to frown, and almost succeeded. Everyone knew by now that the men with the dragon on their chests bore arms because they had chosen to follow Rand, chosen to follow the Dragon Reborn, for no other reason than that they wanted to. The Ilioner had to be wondering where they were going that Rand wanted the Legion, and the Council of 9 was not trusted to know. For that matter, Samaradrid eyed Rand sideways. Only Wyraman was too stupid to think. Rand turned Tidashar away. Narishma's package had been rewrapped into a thinner bundle and tied beneath his left stirrup leather. "Strike the camp. We're moving," he told the 3 nobles. This time, he let Dashiva weave the gateway to take them all away. The plain-faced fellow frowned at him and mumbled to himself. Dashiva actually seemed affronted for some reason, and Gedwin and Rothschild, their horses shoulder by shoulder, watched with sardonic smiles as the silvery slash of light rotated into a hole in nothing. Watched Rand more than Dashiva? Well, let them watch. How often could he see Sayadine and risk falling dizzily on his face before he really did fall? It could not be where they could see. This time the gateway took them to a wide road carved through the low, brushy foothills of mountains to the west. The Namarlan Mountains, not the equals of the Mountains of Mist, and not a patch on the spine of the world, but they rose dark and severe against the sky, sharp peaks that walled the west coast of Ilion. Beyond them lay Cabal Deep, and beyond that... Ben began to recognize the peaks soon enough. Gregorin Panar took one look around and nodded in sudden satisfaction. The other three counselors and Marklin reined close to him to talk while horsemen were still pouring through the gateway. Samaradrid required only a bit longer to puzzle it out, and Tahara, and they also looked as if they understood now. The Silver Road ran from the city to Lugard and carried all of the inland trade for the west. There was a gold road, too, that led to Farmatting. Roads and names alike dated from before there had been an Ilion. Centuries of wagon wheels, hooves, and boots had beaten them hard, and the Samaros could only skim them with mud. They were among the few reliable highways in Ilion for moving large groups of men in winter. Everyone knew about the Shonchan in Abu Dar by this time, though a good many of the tales Rand had heard among the armsmen made the invaders seem Trollocs' meaner cousins. If the Shonchan intended to strike into Ilion, the Silver Road was a good place to gather for defense. Samaradrid and the others thought they knew what he planned. He must have learned that the Shonchan were coming, and the Asherman were there to destroy them when they did. Given the stories about the Shonchan, no one seemed too upset that left little for them to do. Of course, Wireman had to have it explained to him finally, by Tahara, and he was upset, though he tried to mask it behind a grand speech about the wisdom of the Lord Dragon and the military genius of the Lord of the Morning, along with how he personally would lead the first charge against these Shonchan. A pure bull-goose fool. With luck, anyone else who learned of a gathering on the Silver Road would at least not be much brighter than Samaradrid or Gregorin. With luck, no one who mattered would learn before it was too late. Settling into wait, Rand thought it would only be another day or so, but as the days stretched out, he began to wonder whether he might be nearly as big a fool as Wireman. Most of the Asherman were out searching across Ilion and Tyr and the plains of Moredo for the rest of those Rand wanted. Searching through the Samaros. Gateways and traveling were all very well, but even Asherman took time to find who they sought when downpours hit anything 50 paces away, and quagmires dragged rumor to a near halt. Searching Asherman passed within a mile of their quarry in ignorance, and turned only to learn the men had moved on again. Some had farther to go, seeking people not necessarily eager to be found. Days passed before the first brought news. The High Lord Sunaman joined Wireman, a fat man with an unctuous manner, Fort Rand at least. Smooth in his fine silk coat, always smiling, he was voluble in his declarations of loyalty, but he had plotted against Rand so long that he probably did so in his sleep. The High Lord Torian came, with his lumpy farmer's face and his vast wealth, stammering about the honor of riding once more at the Lord Dragon's side. Gold concerned Torian more than anything else, except possibly the privileges Rand had taken away from the nobles in Tyr. He seemed particularly dismayed to learn there were no serving girls in the camp, and not so much as a village nearby where compliant farm girls might be found. Torian had schemed against Rand every bit as often as Sunaman, maybe even more than Guayam or Marakan or Arakom. There were others. There was Bertom Saigon, a short, ruggedly handsome man with the front of his head shaved. He supposedly did not mourn the death of his cousin Colaver too greatly, both because that made him the new high seat of House Saigon, and because rumor said Rand had executed her. Or murdered her. Bertom bowed and smiled, and his smile never reached his dark eyes. Some said he had been very fond of his cousin. Isla Ryoton came, a slim, dignified woman with big, dark eyes, not young, but quite pretty, suggesting that she had a lance captain to lead her armsmen and no desire to take the field in person. Protesting her loyalty for the Lord Dragon, too. But her brother Toran claimed the throne Rand meant for Elaine, and it was whispered that she would do anything for Toran. Anything at all. even join with his enemies, to hamper or to spy, or both, of course. Dauthanus Annalin came, and Amondred Osilin, and Doresen Chuliandred, lords who had supported Colaver's seizure of the Sun Throne when they thought Rand would never return to Cairhien. Cairhienin and Tyron, they were brought in one by one with 50 retainers, or at most 100. Men and women he trusted even less than he did Gregorin or Samaradrid. Most were men, not because he thought the women any less dangerous. He was not that big a fool. A woman would kill you twice as fast as a man, and usually for half the reason. But because he could not bring himself to take any woman except the most dangerous where he was going. Eilil could smile warmly while she calculated where to plant the knife in your ribs. Analula, a willowy, simpering high lady who gave a fair imitation of a beautiful goose brain, had returned to Tyr from Cairhien and openly begun talking of herself for the as-yet non-existent throne of Tyr. Perhaps she was a fool, but she had managed to gain a great deal of support, both among nobles and in the streets. So he gathered them in, all the folk who had been too long out from under his eye. He could not watch all of them all the time, but he could not afford to let them forget that he did watch sometimes. He gathered them and he waited. For 2 days. Gnashing his teeth, he waited. 5 days. 8. Rain was beating a diminishing drum on his tent when the last man he was waiting for finally arrived. Shaking a small torrent from his oiled cloth cape, Davram Bashir blew out his thick, gray-streaked mustaches in disgust and tossed the cape over a barrel chair. A short man with a great hooked beak of a nose, he seemed larger than he was. Not because he strutted, but because he assumed that he was as tall as any man present, and other men took him so. Wise men did. The wolf-headed ivory baton of the Marshal General of Saldaea, tucked carelessly behind his sword belt, had been earned on scores of battlefields and at as many council tables. He was one of the very few men Rand would trust with his life. "I know you don't like explaining," Bashir muttered, "but I could use a little illumination." Adjusting his serpentine sword, he sprawled in another chair and flung a leg over the arm of it. He always seemed at ease, but he could uncoil faster than a whip. "That Ashaman fellow wouldn't say more than you needed me yesterday. Yet he said not to bring more than 1,000 men. I only had half that with me, but I brought them. It can't be a battle. Half the sigils I saw up there belong to men who'd bite their tongues if they saw a fellow behind you with a knife, and most of the rest are men who'd try to hold your attention if they hadn't paid the knife man in the first place." Seated behind his writing table in his shirt sleeves, Rand wearily pressed the heels of his palms against his eyes. With Borina Caravan left behind, the lamp wicks needed proper trimming, and a faint haze of smoke hung in the air. Besides, he had been awake most of the night, poring over the maps scattered across the table. Maps of southern Altara. No two agreed on very much. "If you're going to fight a battle," he told Bashir, "who better to pay the butcher's bill than men who want you dead? Anyway, it isn't soldiers who will win this battle. All they have to do is keep anybody from sneaking up on the Ashaman. What do you think of that?" Bashir snorted so hard that his heavy mustaches stirred. "I think it's a deadly stew, is what I think. Somebody's going to choke to death on it. The light sent it isn't us." And then he laughed, as if that were a fine joke. Luz Theron laughed, too. Chapter 22. Gathering Clouds. Under a steady drizzle, Rand's small army formed columns across the low folded hills facing the Nemerellan peaks, dark and sharp against the western sky. There was no real need to face the direction you intended to travel, but it always felt askew to Rand otherwise. Despite the rain, rapidly thinning gray clouds let through startlingly bright sunshine, or maybe the day only seemed bright, after all the recent gloom. 4 of the columns were headed by Bashir's Saldaeans, bandy-legged unarmored men in short coats standing patiently beside their mounts beneath a small forest of shining lance heads. The other 5 by blue-coated men with a dragon on their chests, commanded by a short, stocky fellow named Jack Masson. When Masson moved, it was always with surprising quickness, but he was utterly still now, feet planted astride and hands folded behind his back. His men were in place, and so were the defenders and companions, grumpy about being behind infantry. It was the nobles and their folk, mainly, who milled about as if unsure where to go. Thick mud sucked at hooves and boots, and mired cartwheels. Shouted curses rose. It took time to line up nearly 6,000 soaked men, getting wetter by the minute, and that was not counting the supply carts and the remounts. Rand had donned his finest so he would stand out at a glance. A lick with the power had polished the dragon scepter's spearhead to mirror brightness, and another had burnished the crown of swords so the gold gleamed. The gilded dragon buckle of his sword belt caught the light, and so did the thread of gold embroidery that covered his blue silk coat. For a moment he regretted giving away the gems that once had decked his sword's hilt and scabbard. The dark boarhide was serviceable, but any armsman could have worn that. Let men know who he was. Let the Seanchan know who had come to destroy them. Sitting tie-dye Shar on a broad flat, he impatiently watched the nobles roil about on the hills. A little way off on the flat, Gedwin and Rochide sat their saddles in front of their men, all formed into a precise box, dedicated in the front rank, soldiers lined up behind. They looked ready to parade. As many had gray hair, or nearly none, as were young. Several were as young as Hopwill or more, but every one was strong enough to make a gateway. That had been a requirement. Flynn and Deshiva waited behind Rand in a casual cluster with Adley and Moore, Hopwill and Narishma, and a rigid pair of mounted bannermen, one Tyran and one Kyrienan, their breastplates and helmets and even their steel-backed gauntlets buffed and polished till they shone. The crimson banner of light and the long white dragon banner hung limp and dripping. Rand had assumed the power in his tent, where his momentary stagger would not be seen, and the sparse rain failed by an inch to touch him or his horse. The taint on Saidin felt especially heavy today, a thick, foul oil that oozed into his pores and stained his bones deep, stained his soul. He had thought himself accustomed to the vileness, after a fashion, yet today it was nauseating, stronger than the frozen fire and molten cold of Saidin itself. He held on to the source as often as possible now, accepting the vileness to avoid the new sickness of seizing it. It could be deadly if he let sickness distract him from that struggle. Maybe it was connected to the dizzy spells somehow. Light, he could not go mad yet, and he could not die, not yet. There was too much still to be done. He pressed his left leg against tie-dye Shar's flank just to feel the long bundle strapped beneath stirrup leather and scarlet saddlecloth. Every time he did that, something wriggled across the outside of the void. Anticipation, and maybe a touch of fear. Well trained, the gelding started to turn left, and Rand had to rein him back. When would the nobles sort themselves out? He ground his teeth in impatience. He could remember as a boy hearing men laugh that when rain fell in sunshine, the Dark One was beating Semirhage. Some of that laughter had been uneasy, though, and scrawny old Sen Bui would always snarl that Semirhage would be smarting and angry after that, and come for small boys who did not keep out of their elders' way. That had been enough to send Rand running, when he was little. He wished Semirhage would come for him now, right that instant. He would make her weep. Nothing makes Semirhage weep, Lews Therin muttered. She gives tears to others, but she has none for herself. Rand laughed softly. If she came today, he would make her weep. Her and the rest of the Forsaken together, if they came today. Most assuredly, he would make the Seanchan weep. Not everyone was pleased with the orders he had given. Sunamon's oily smile vanished when he thought Rand did not see. Torion had a flask in his saddlebags, no doubt brandy, or maybe several flasks, because he drank steadily and never appeared to run dry. Samaradrid and Marcolin and Tahara each appeared in front of Rand to protest the numbers with somber faces. A few years before, close on 6,000 men would have been army enough for any war, but they had seen armies in the tens of thousands now, hundreds of thousands, as an Arthur Hawkwing's day, and to go against the Shonchan, they wanted far more. He sent them away disgruntled. They did not understand that 50 Arashaman were as big a hammer as anyone could wish for. Rand wondered what they would have said had he told them he was hammer enough by himself. He had considered doing this by himself. It might come to that yet. Wyraman came. He did not like having to take orders from Bashir, or the fact that they were going into mountains. Very hard to mount a decent charge in mountains. Or several other things. Rand was certain there were at least several more that Rand did not let him utter. "The Saldaean seems to believe I should ride on the right flank," Wyraman muttered disparagingly. He twisted his shoulders, as though the right flank were a great insult for some reason. "And the foot, my Lord Dragon. Really, I think you should get your men ready," Rand said coldly. Part of the chill was the effect of floating in emotionless emptiness. "Or you won't be on any flank." He meant that he would leave the man behind if he were not ready in time. Surely such a fool could not make much trouble left in this remote spot with only a few armsmen. Rand would be back before he could ride to anything larger than a village. Blood drained from Wyraman's face, though. "As my Lord Dragon commands," he said, briskly for him, and whirling his horse away before the words were well out of his mouth. His mount was a tall, deep-chested bay today. The pale lady Ailil reined to a stop in front of Rand, accompanied by the high lady Anayla, a strange pair to be in company, and not just because their nations hated one another. Ailil was tall for a Carianan woman, if only for a Carianan, and everything about her was dignity and precision, from the arch of her eyebrow, to the turn of her red-gloved wrist, to the way her pearl-collared rain cape lay spread across the rump of her smoke-gray mare. Unlike Samaradrid, or Marcolin, Wyraman, or Tehera, she did not so much as blink at the sight of raindrops sliding down nothing around him. Anayla did blink, and gasp, and titter behind her hand. Anayla was willowy and darkly beautiful, her rain cape collared with rubies and embroidered with gold besides, but there any resemblance to Ailil ended. Anayla was all mincing elegance and simpers. When she bowed, her white gelding did too, bending its forelegs. The prancing animal was showy, but Rand suspected it had no bottom, like its mistress. "My Lord Dragon," Ailil said, "I must make one more protest against my inclusion in this expedition." Her voice was coolly neutral, if not exactly unfriendly. "I will send my retainers where you command, and when. But I have no desire at all to be in the thick of a battle." "Oh, no," Anayla added, with a delicate shudder. Even her tone simpered. "Nasty things, battles. So my master of the horse says. Surely you won't really make us go, my Lord Dragon. We've heard you have a particular care for women. Haven't we, Ailil?" Rand was so astonished that the void collapsed and Sayadine vanished. Raindrops began to trickle through his hair and seep through his coat. But for a moment, clutching his saddle's high pommel to hold himself upright, seeing 4 women instead of 2, he was too stunned to notice. How much did they know? They had heard. How many people knew? How did anyone know? Light. Rumor had him killing Morghese, Elaine, Coliver. 100 women, probably, and each in a worse way than the last. He swallowed against the urge to sick up. That was only partly Sayadine's fault. Burn me. How many spies are there watching me? The thought was a growl. "The dead watch," Luce Theron whispered. "The dead never close their eyes." Rand shivered. "I do try to be careful of women," he told them when he could speak. "Faster than a man, and for half the reason. That's why I want to keep you close the next few days."
All right, everyone, I'm gonna call into this live for tonight. Excuse me. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all support. Until next time, everyone, y'all stay safe out there.